I'd like to spend a little bit of time playing with some of the more advanced technology on the machine, and we'll start with the sensor pen. To activate the sensor pen, we're going to touch the icon that looks like a sensor pen, and here you see that you can use it for 4 different techniques. The first thing that you can do with your sensor pen is to adjust the positioning of the guideline marker. So we've talked about that guideline marker, we calibrated or adjusted our guideline marker, and now you actually have the ability to position the guideline marker by using the sensor pen. So when I activate this icon here, I can touch anywhere on the bed of my machine. Let's say I want it to be in the 1/4 inch position, and it automatically moves the guideline marker over. I touched a little bit too far to the right, so I could scoot over again. And it's showing me also on screen the positioning of my guideline marker in relation to center needle position. Now on screen here, you can see that we have 0 to 7, and that is representing the 7mm width area of our decorative stitches. So this is a 7mm stitch machine. So within the needle opening of the presser foot, I have a 7mm area in which I can adjust stitches. 3.5 is center, 0 is all the way to the left, 7 is all the way to the right. And what's cool about the guide beam is that you can actually move it farther away than what's in that defined stitching area. And I like that because it allows me to be able to use the guide beam for perfectly parallel rows of stitching. So the fact that I can move it beyond just the stitching field is a really helpful tool for me. So I'm going to touch cancel to get out of this screen, and it's okay to delete that setting. I'll touch the sensor pen icon again, and now we'll use it to position our needle. So exactly where our needle is landing on our fabric. And here we have just that 7mm opening or area in which we can position our needle because it's got to be able to stitch within the opening of the foot. So an example I like to use for this is if I'm top stitching and I want to place my stitches exactly in the ditch of my top stitching, I could touch on my fabric exactly where that ditch might be, and it moves it into position for me. Now, it has moved the guideline marker, but it hasn't yet moved the needle. It doesn't move the needle until I touch OK. The next option that we have with the sensor pen is to use it to adjust the width of a stitch, but it's grayed out right now, and that's because I'm on a straight stitch, which has no width to it. So I'm going to select a zigzag. So I'll close out of my sensor pen screen, select a zigzag stitch, and bring the sensor pen menu back up, and now I have the ability to adjust the width. So when I touch this icon, now I can set the width of the zigzag stitch that I'm going to stitch. Now, if you were wanting to stitch it a certain width on a seam, if you're doing crazy patch stitching, of course you would have fabric underneath the presser foot. For this purpose, let's just say we want to set our zigzag to be exactly of 1/4 inch wide. I can first touch on the 1/4 inch marking on my needle plate. Now I'll touch OK on screen to confirm that setting. And then I've got to select my second side of the width, if you will. So I'll touch center needle position. And once again, I'll touch OK on screen to confirm. And my zigzag stitch is now exactly 1/4 inch wide. So as I would begin stitching, I could measure it if I wanted, and I would have a 1/4 inch wide stitch. Finally, with the sensor pen, if I touch the sensor pen menu one more time, I have the ability to define an ending point. I absolutely love this feature. So this right here with the blue arrow pointing down allows me to set the distance that I'm sewing. So if I'm working on lining up stitching together or on a seam, or I'm stitching across a seam and I want to stop in a very specific point, I have the ability to touch anywhere within the area of my accessory compartment. It measures the distance that it's going to stitch, and I would touch OK and begin sewing. So if I've selected an area that's much more than a couple of inches long, the machine's going to sew a little ways, stop, ask me to reconfirm by touching on fabric again, the ending point, and then when I continue on sewing, it's going to sew exactly to the point that I have defined and stopped. Now there are a couple of different ways that you can do this. You can ask the machine to stop at the end of a stitch sequence or mid-stitch. If you stop mid-stitch, you can touch this icon right here. You've got these little, almost like tulip shapes of a stitch. And when you have that option selected, the machine is going to stitch to the point and stop no matter where you are in the sequence of your stitch. But if you wanted to actually complete the stitch sequence before it stops so you don't leave off mid-stitch, you could touch this option right here. And the machine is so smart, it will actually recalibrate and resize the stitching so that it can completely finish the stitch sequence you are on before it stops on your marked end point. So I'll touch OK to get out of the sensor pen screens, and we've talked a little bit about the guideline marker with regard to the sensor pen, but let's talk more in depth about the guideline marker now. On your screen with those yellow icons that we saw, we have the guideline marker option. And when you have the guideline marker activated, you automatically have this wonderful marking that's coming out from the needle position straight out toward you. And what I love about this is that it shows me exactly where the machine is going to be stitching. Now what's really cool is I do have the ability to move around the positioning of that guideline marker. So let's put a piece of fabric underneath of the presser foot, and I'll lift my foot up. And now you can really see that guideline marker. And you have the ability to move it around. So here on screen, next to the guideline marker icon, some more information popped up. It's telling me right now that my guideline marker is at a 3.5 millimeter setting. We mentioned earlier that this Crescendo is a 7 millimeter machine, so 3.5 is center needle position. But I've also got the ability to move that around, either to the right or to the left. And now when I move that guideline marker, you can actually see it moving on the fabric. And this can be really helpful if you know that you want to position your stitching, say, right along the inside edge of your foot, or a center needle position, or wherever you need to position that fabric as you sew. So now I've got the ability to really position where I'm sewing, and it can use that guideline marker not just for positioning of my stitches, but for positioning of the fabric as well. So say you needed to be running right along the edge of your fabric and you have a hard time sewing straight, that guideline marker gives you a nice long extension along the edge of your fabric to help you to stay straight. You could be running that right along the cut edge of your fabric for perfect seam allowances. You could use that in the ditch for ditch quilting. There are lots and lots of different applications for this guideline marker, and we've got a couple of other videos that get a little bit more in depth about uses for the guideline marker.